in terms of mechanisms, and that brings us to Islamic finance, the positive measures being zakah and hisbah, voluntary measures, the charitable givings, as well as the trust, and positive prohibitive measures, that is riba. As we can see, Islamic moral economy cannot be relegated only into the financing. Financing is only a part of this process. And by saying that, I'm not trying to undermine the contribution of finance generally, and Islamic finance in particular makes to our life. But what I'm trying to highlight, it is not everything. It is part of the whole system. And that is something that we have to keep in mind, as I believe. Of course, in terms of institutions and instruments, elimination of riba, financial system, hisbah, for instance, as I mentioned, for market regulation, zakah and takaful, and as well as the trust system is an important aspect of this moral economy. Now, in reflecting on these issues, so we have this utopian moral economy here. And I accept that it is utopic, but it is there to provide us principles and philosophical foundation on which we can probably establish something different which may not necessarily run into the same difficulties as conventional finance has been running into. And therefore, the whole effort anyway with Islamic finance, why Islamic finance? What distinguishes it from other financing? It is this package. This package is there to distinguish Islamic finance from other financiers. So it is that normative aspect. It is there to guide us in our economic and financial activities. And therefore, this moral economy has consequences for Islamic finance in terms of shaping that Islamic finance. Of course, as mentioned, Islamic finance is only the operational tool of this moral economy. However, that moral economy in the aspirational sense aims to operationalize and fulfill the economic system, the moral economic system, as I mentioned. However, when we look at critically to the development of Islamic finance, we see a pragmatist development. Of course, realities are different, and those realities, one way or another, shaped the development and the nature of Islamic finance. But at the same time, again, not a radicalist position, but a realist position. Looking at Islamic finance in 1970 is coming into reality as very much related with the petrodollars. With the rush to halalize petrodollars, one way or another paved the way for rushing into developing something which is not necessarily authentically responding to the moral economy. That elitist nature of financing is something. And therefore, systemic understanding of Islamic moral economy has not been achieved through the activities of Islamic finance. It was probably too much in terms of expectations. On the one hand, having huge amounts of money in the Middle East, trying to find a way to utilize in the financial system, but on the other hand, talking about a moral economy. That was a difficulty probably of the founding fathers and the later generations. But the initial experience, of course, is an interesting thing to remember. In particular, the Egyptian experience in mid-1960s, mid-GUM, again being a bank, but it aimed at responding to the objectives or the moral economy nature, as I mentioned. However, since 1990s, with the globalization of Islamic finance, in particular such moral values is something that is no longer discussed in the Islamic finance circle. And only relegating the ethical nature of Islamic finance to the prohibition of riba is something that cannot be acceptable as an ethical position. And I mean, when I talk about these things, it is not because of my general belief that I'm discussing, but at the same time, it is because of the evidence and the data. A number of PhDs, for instance, conducted under my supervision on the corporate social responsibility in Islamic finance. And unfortunately, the results are terribly discouraging in terms of how they contribute to the larger societies in terms of stakeholders. And again, when we look at, for instance, the financing nature is an important issue. The data shows, for instance, for Malaysian Islamic banking, musharaka is only 2.5% in the total Islamic financing. It is the whole idea with Islamic finance, profit and loss sharing, the venture capital. And what it is only 2.5%. When we look at Gulf, in the Gulf, the musharaka is around 16-17% in the entire financing system. It shows that aspirations, which, for instance, musharaka is one of such products, I understand and accept from the financial points, the difficulties with risk issues, I understand totally. But on the other hand, there is that reality, that moral economy requirement asking us profit and loss sharing mostly. And that is not happening in the Gulf, around 16%. In Malaysia, 2.5% only as part of, because everyone is after, of course, maximization of profit. And therefore, as we can see, the shift in the paradigm from social justice contributing to the development of society to individual utility or the profit maximization and efficiency. That paradigm shift is an important aspect of what the reality that we have in front of us. Therefore, at the end of the day, what we have is an Islamic finance is now part of a global financial system and is considered to be part of the global financial system, and the convergence, therefore, we would have expected that the convergence in terms of ethicality should have run from Islamic finance to conventional finance to introduce further ethical understanding into conventional finance, but it seems that the convergence have run the other way around. The most of the ethical and the moral understanding of Islamic finance have been given up in return for profitability and efficiency. And therefore, Tawarruk, for instance, is a reality. Of course, in the Gulf, it is not prohibited, but in Malaysia, it is. So from asset-based to the debt-based financing is being very popular. Again, running against the aspirational dimension of Islamic economics.